Eli?
Hey Spencer, how are you?
I'm good. Like myself, you've just returned from Iraq. You've been there. How long were you there? Six weeks or so?
7 weeks or so.
7.
It's a little under 7, I think.
As Blogging Heads viewers know, you gave some really fascinating and regular updates while you were in Baghdad, which I should tell as kind of a confession to our audience and a mea culpa to the Blogging Heads blog father, Bob Wright, I was unable to do. And I'm very embarrassed and ashamed by the fact that you were able to pull this off, and I wasn't.
It's all in the MacBook. It's the new MacBook. With a little camera on it.
Yeah,
That's all it is.
Yeah, the Sony Vaio does not really lend itself well to the Blogging Heads format. So thanks to Blogging Heads' Brian for helping me out with that. But I also have to blame my own laziness, as when I was getting ready to go in March, I was kind of loath to pack the Blogging Heads camera in my gear, and so
yeah, you want to keep as little gear with you as possible, especially on the kind of thing that we did, which is, I mean, I did part of my trip unilaterally to Kurdistan, but most of it was embedding like you, and you just want to pack as lightly as you can, I think.
You're totally right about that.
That was the best advice that you gave me. I remember because we had dinner right before I left, and you said just pack really lightly. Well, take as little stuff as possible, which was really that was the best advice.
Well, thank you. I'm glad I could help you out. This is another example of the liberals sitting down with the neocons in a spirit of camaraderie and friendship to give as much as possible. We seek to bring the truth to the people, and if we can help one another out, we fulfilled a mutual interest.
Well, I mean, we should tell the Blogging Heads viewers, if it's of interest, that Spencer and I are very good friends.
It's true.
When I was in Cairo, Spencer was the custodian of my awesome record collection because he basically subletted this house in Adams Morgan neighborhood of Washington. So
and a tremendously impressive record collection it is, and it's sort of interesting. A kind of insight into Eli Lake's mindset that he tells you that I was the custodian of his record collection rather than subletting his apartment as the primary clause in that statement. The apartment was, in fact, as I believe your new apartment is, simply an adjunct vessel for the stowing of records, and on the side it serves the purpose of giving you a shelter and a warm place to sleep at night. Much like Iraq, in a very bad segue, we've both been there fairly recently, and I think we both went there. Yeah.
Let's start with your excellent piece in the Washington Monthly.
Thank you.
On sort of Democrats who want to end the war, and then the position of soldiers who you've encountered in Iraq who really believe in the mission, and the politics of how all of that works out. So what did you find, Spencer, when you talked to soldiers about the prospect of withdrawal?
Well, all throughout 2005 and 2006, when I would talk to soldiers, not in Iraq, but people, friends of mine who were over there, or contacts of mine who were over there, or people who had just returned, what I had found was something of a parallel between the kind of disillusionment that the rest of America was feeling with the mission and what they were feeling themselves. They found themselves, I wouldn't say demoralized, but increasingly doubtful that what they were doing was really passing beyond the immediate mission of the moment to something more lasting, more substantive. And I was very surprised when I went there in March, about a month into the surge, that all of a sudden nearly everyone I talked to in uniform, and civilians as well, demonstrated a lot of enthusiasm. Not just the sense that new vistas were open, the strategy that more beneficial things were possible for Iraq and for the United States, but that there was this reinvigorated sense that they themselves were making a difference, and that difference added up to something more significant in the broader picture. What I had heard before was a lot, about how the famous coffee cup slogan, Operation Iraqi Freedom, we were winning when I left, wasn't so much in effect anymore. The company I embedded with in Baghdad at first, the 57th Military Police Company, which was based in western Baghdad, had been there toward the tail end of their rotation. I'm sorry to say they've just been extended. They were supposed to go home in a couple days, in fact. And they had sort of been there since last summer, and they had sweated through a whole lot of frustration with IED attacks, with complex attacks, VBIDs, this sort of thing that I'm sure your guys dealt with a lot for not a whole lot of gain. And then all of a sudden, starting in late January and early February, they were coming under a significantly reduced operational tempo of attacks. They were finding a lot more improvement with the Iraqi police they were partnering with, and we'll come back to that. And generally, they had a sense, as the company commander, a captain named Robert McNellis, who's a really fantastic individual, said to me that the momentum was on their side. When I would go around with one of his platoon leaders, a lieutenant named Jonathan Wellman, the guy was just really enthusiastic about the prospect of fighting terrorists, of coming under attack and returning fire. We both went to a really hot section of Haifa Street, hot in terms of both the weather, I'm sure, and the amount of attacks that U.S. forces used to come under there. You wrote a very good story about Haifa Street in the Sun not long ago. In which Wellman would point out to me the places that he both took fire and with a sense of real pride and accomplishment where he returned fire. And this became something that I found, not just sociologically, interesting, but also politically significant. Over the last several years, really since 9/11, the Democratic Party has positioned itself as much as it can on the side of the warfighter, if not necessarily the war. And to a great degree, with the recruitment of the 2006 fighting Democrat candidates, the ones in the House especially, and Jim Webb in the Senate, who were military veterans and many of them Iraq and Afghanistan veterans, there was a sense in both Democratic recruitment strategy and in some of the rhetoric you see on the left that there's a greater sense of deference to soldier views.
Like support the troops, bring them
home. And what I just increasingly found was that just, soldiers there want to fight this war. It's not universal. I have to admit, this is an anecdotal experience as much reporting is. But nevertheless, it really does speak, the more I delve into it, to, really the ethos of the warfighter, and it's something you want as a nation, to know that your army is in, and your armed forces more generally, not just the army, but I was with the army, are prepared and to some degree enthusiastic about taking up the challenge that's set out for them. And this can coexist with all the normal frustrations that occur during the war. And sure, I got a whole lot of griping, as you can imagine, really anyone would. When they're around people who have a tremendously arduous and both psychologically and physically demanding task. But what I wanted to sort of bring to the debate, and if I did my job and pulled it off in the Washington Monthly, was a sense for Democrats as they coalesce behind a position of ending the war, that this is going to be an acrimonious experience with precisely the sort of people in the military that the party had been trying to sort of woo back, or at least demonstrate for the first time in a very long time, that it had no fundamental beef with the military, and that combined with the party's increasingly anti-war stance is really going to rub many people in uniform the wrong way. Is that going to be politically significant in terms of ultimately hindering the end of the war? I don't really think so. This has many more dynamics than simply the relationship between soldiers and civilians. But it is a factor that Democrats and liberals more generally will have to take stock of. That as much as you would like to have your cake and eat it too, and say support the troops and the war, that's not the way many, and I would venture to say most of them see it. And I'll end that and get your comments on this with just this one quote that Lieutenant Wellman gave me when I was asking about it directly. I was asking about the movement at home to bring the war to a conclusion, and if he thought what he made of that, what that represented to him, and he said, everyone says support the troops, and sure, maybe they do support the troops, but I don't want them to just support the troops. I want them to support the mission. Everyone here in his men, dutifully huad, they support the mission as well, and so it seemed to be an element of the story that many on my side, on the left and the liberal side of it, didn't really seem to take account of. So I wanted to bring that story out.
Well, I liked the piece a lot, despite not liking the first 3 graphs. They were all about how the unwinnableness of the war, but It was a very interesting, and it was a really good example of sort of allowing the reporting to maybe kind of. Well, I don't know if it was an assumption beforehand, but it was sort of. I thought it was a really valuable piece that I think that left and right, and middle, and everyone should read. What I wanted to ask you about are 2 things. One is my favorite part is that you have an exchange in there with a soldier where he first says sexy, and someone says like women in bikinis. It's like why do you need women in bikinis? You've got terrorists with AKs. And I thought you captured in that part of the piece something that I came across, which was that there is a sense among a lot of enlisted people in the military that their job is going to be inherently violent, and they wish they had gotten more firefights. What they don't like is IEDs and the improvised explosive devices, and the vehicle bombs, the VBIDs. But the idea that there's an enemy and that they want to kill the enemy is something that there is a large group of people, as maybe some people would sort of expect in the military, to be very enthusiastic about this. But there is a sort of liberal notion that I grew up with in a fairly left-leaning household, that the military in basic training brainwashes you, and it turns otherwise peaceful people into folks who are capable of killing a stranger and another human being. And I just sort of, one of the things I found when I was in Iraq, and I kind of got the sense from your reporting too, that it's to say that there are actually a lot of people who volunteer for this military who like the idea of having an enemy and killing them.
That's totally my experience. One point to make there. My sense is that the impulse among liberals to say that people who join the military are brainwashed, or they're being duped in some manner, or they're not really able to make enlightened decisions for themselves.
Or that there are economic incentives as to why they join, like, they want to get college benefits. But it's that it is, I think, a noble profession, the military. So I think you would say that too. And there are people who know what the job entails, which is to say, and it's not all violence. In fact, a lot of, as I think would say, a lot of what the military is doing now is, anything, counterinsurgency doctrine is, a lot of it is politics and diplomacy and, infrastructure building and so forth. So I don't want to give that impression, but there is, at its core, there is a sense that this is what the military does. Yeah,
I just wanted to make the point that that notion that you bring up, it's sort of telling that you say this was something that you grew up with, that sense of the military being duped as a kind of liberal talking point. I don't really see that so much around people, our age and younger on the left. I think that is something of a holdover from an older generation. One of the reasons that I wanted to write this piece was precisely because what I see more is kind of the opposite perspective on the left. The idea that if you can just find liberals in uniform, or people in uniform who sort of go along with the broader policy recommendations that many on the left pick up with, the deference that they want to have towards the military can come out all the more strongly. I think 9/11 really did change that on the left, particularly among younger people, that you sort of broader civilian deference to the military and to people who serve is almost uncritically, in some cases, exhibited on the left as well as on the right.
Yeah. Here's the other thing I wanted to ask you, because it came up in some of the comments on my dialogues with Bob, which is, did you get the impression that as a journalist, the troops were being candid with you? There were some people who questioned the candor of a major that I brought on and one of the blogging heads, and that, of course, anyone talking to a reporter in the military would have to say that the mission is worth fighting for. So, I mean, do you think that to a certain extent it's like that, you couldn't observe as a journalist in an embedded situation, troops that were exhausted and didn't, believe in the mission, didn't understand why they were fighting. What's your sense on that?
My sense on that is it actually varied depending on my level of familiarity with people. Naturally, as with any situation, people are wary around a reporter at the beginning of an embed, and the longer you take to establish a relationship with someone, the more you get a whole lot of griping, a whole lot of more candor, and candor isn't just expressed by the sense that they're going to whisper to you something like I really I hate this war, blah blah blah.
Cheney.
Yeah, I mean you get it in a variety of different ways. I mean I wrote a story based on my trip about the difficulties in training or mentoring the Iraqi security forces that we can get into later, but many of them expressed to me quite immediately how arduous they were finding it. It just didn't go along with the standard notion of candor is expressed to a reporter by giving some kind of deep dark secret that either they hate the war or they brutally massacred a whole bunch of people. That's
right.
It's different, and it's not their job to be off the bat candid with you. They're there to fight a war. It's your job as a reporter to get honest answers or detailed responses or introspection as you observe and you go along, and you've just got to do your best to get that out of people. I found that I got a great deal of access from the 57th, and thank you guys very much. There was one instance in which my access was completely shut down, where an Iraqi police commander started talking about the Iraqi army as being basically targets for them, and taking out.
Whoa, that's a good segue to the next segment. Yeah.
Yeah, and the lieutenant there just shut down that interview and basically just walked out, got me to go out, said that he was having some problems with the translation, which was clearly false. But that will happen. Embedding is a double-edged sword. You get a lot of access. You may not get all the access you want, and also you've got to worry when you go interview people, particularly Iraqis, that you're a journalist who all of a sudden is wearing a ton of body armor and is surrounded by U.S. soldiers, and that's going to influence their responses to you. They're not there. I think there is really where you've got to be worried and more skeptical is probably the better way of putting it. About the candor and the gravity of the information you receive, not so much from the Americans. Not that candor isn't an issue, but there because you speak the language, at least in most cases, you have more of an opportunity to just do your job and ferret information out. I mean, did you find that people weren't candid with you, or was this more of a question that you just got from comments?
I mean, first of all, I felt that I can cite many examples of soldiers who are quoted on the record in news stories where they say negative things about their experience in Iraq. I mean, you can find that in the New York Times every day. I mean, there's a famous quote from a Colonel Duke who I met, who had just given to AFP in the middle of like one of these midnight Humvee patrols, which I'm sure you went on these and they're stressful. They're very stressful. And sort of musing about the war, he said, "It's just great. I get 2 Thanksgivings, 2 Christmases, and 1 divorce."
Right.
Talking about the extension, I mean, that's not a very positive quote. That doesn't engender people to think that what maybe other sort of. But then I think it's complicated, and that I mean, I think to be fair, it's the surge is made possible by extending the tours of people fighting it and calling up people who are fighting it, they're training earlier than they normally would go, and this is more time away from people's families. It means that people have plans that they had to break, and there are a lot of times, I mean, a lot of soldiers I talked to would fix on a date when they would get home of something they would do, and they would, 3 months means that it's another season, and there is a psychological effect, and I don't like that. On the other hand, I also encountered what you did, which is that a lot of soldiers felt that what they were doing this time made a difference. And they did. I saw in my 2 embeds, which were fairly long, that the soldiers that I talked to felt that what they were doing, did have a chance of success, and they were enthusiastic about it. Though they were also pretty candid with me about a lot of the challenges, and I would say, although this may come as a surprise, that my reporting in a lot of cases reflected less optimism than what some of the soldiers were telling me. I mean, I just want to say that I saw things that kind of made me definitely say this is a serious issue, which is kind of going to get us to the next question.
Yeah.
Which is what you sort of started mentioning, and I'm skipping around from our original format here, Spencer, but I want to talk about sectarian security forces.
Yeah.
And your second piece that you had come out this week or in the last week, which is in The Nation. I just have to, the title of the piece, which is said training the next death squad militias, I did not agree with. But the piece is really a must read, and it's excellent color to really bring you in to what the Iraqi police do and the challenges that they face. So why don't you talk a little bit about, as you see it,
Sure.
What is the mission right now for the Iraqi police?
Well, the Iraqi police increasingly take on the ultimate burden of counterinsurgency, which is, after the army and after the U.S. military will take hold of the place under the Baghdad Security Plan or Fard al-Qanun, it'll be first the army and the police together, and then ultimately the police that will keep, and this is still over the course of a tremendously, long and rather indefinite amount of time, the peace inside that neighborhood. And what I kept finding when I went around with the Iraqi police is that just bottom to top, they are infiltrated by militias and death squads, particularly on the Shiite side. And this goes to the earlier point we were making about, American optimism. Almost always did I find that Iraqi police commanders themselves and Iraqi policemen were not just less optimistic, but just deeply, deeply fatalistic about what their men were accomplishing. And what I kept hearing in basically every neighborhood I went to from every police commander I talked to was that as many as half their men they couldn't trust, that various militias, particularly the Mahdi army of Muqtada Sadr, was infiltrating the station, often at the behest of the Interior Ministry, which is probably the most powerful ministry in Iraq right now, definitely the most powerful security force in Iraq right now. And as long as they were in the station, what they were doing while in uniform was basically collecting intelligence on members of the other sect. This did work in some cases with Sunnis in the police, and checking out what they could on the Shiite areas. But I was in West Baghdad, which is sort of the last bastion of Sunni Baghdad, and what police commanders were telling me was that they were getting sent men basically direct from the death squads, that they were basically there to collect intelligence on the last Sunni bastions of Iraq, and then when they got out of uniform, they would basically scourge the neighborhood. And the police commanders would say again and again, I have no control over this. And I wanted to talk with the military police company about that, and ultimately all the way up to brigade headquarters about what to do about that. And in both a realistic and probably a fatalistic answer, the response I got was that you really can't do anything about the presence of sectarianism inside these institutions. Sectarianism is deeply entrenched within the Iraqi political scene and the Iraqi social apparatus. What you can do, and this is really the strategy at this point with dealing with sectarianism in the police force and dealing with militias in the police, is as soon as you get hard evidence of a crime being committed, you go after that criminal and punish him with great alacrity. And, that's really probably the best that they can do. It's not really something that lends itself to a military solution. If you were going to just cashier the entire, or half an Iraqi police station, you'd have a gigantic amount of trouble. It really just goes to show at this point, how the ultimate long-term strategy, sort of after the surge, especially now that both General Pace and even the President has been sort of hinting that, there will be a point in which in the near future, probably in 2008, they'll get back off the combat footing and back onto more of a training footing. really has a huge and possibly insuperable obstacle that goes along with this. And the reason why the piece is called what it's called isn't because the Americans are out to train death squads, as sort of an earlier meme had it around, I believe, like 2004 or 2005 with the so-called Salvador option of directly sponsoring, a Shiite and Kurdish, force of destruction. But instead, what's happening is as the military is giving, greater competence and greater training and ultimately greater capability.
Used for sectarian motives.
That's right. And there's no real way you can filter out one from the other.
I got a sense of the problems in the. I didn't think it. Well, I don't know. I didn't like the title, but then it's The Nation, so I understand it. And we don't pick. We journalists, the reporters, the people who submit pieces, do not choose the titles of our articles, as I think. But here's what I wanted to ask: was this police unit that you observed, were they at sort of going on joint patrols, or was there a lot of coordination with the Americans? Were Americans kind of constantly checking up on them and so forth?
You get it's a lot of checking up at different areas. There's something called, just so our readers know, there are these things around Baghdad called Joint Security Stations, or JSSs, in which American soldiers live with, or in many cases live with, units from the Iraqi police. They're often in police stations in Baghdad.
And they have they have bi-weekly meetings.
Yeah, units with the Iraqi army as well, come down, and some from the national police as well. So that's the joint security station. And what would happen, when I would go out to the JSSs or when I would go out to the police stations themselves, is you would have basically a checkup on a variety of different issues from the U.S. military. Including, logistics. Does everyone have enough fuel? Does everyone have enough bullets? What's the situation with bulletproof vests? What kind of information have you gotten over the last, say 24 hours?
Sure.
And there's more of a bird's eye view at the JSS and more of a ground eye view at the police stations themselves. And what you would then see in many cases would be the joint patrols that you're talking about, where Iraqi unarmored vehicles, usually like flatbeds and pickup trucks with a gunner on top, strapped in, would go out sort of weaved in between Humvees, and we would go from one side of the sector to the other, just sort of seeing what we can see. And I saw guys get pulled over, people get arrested. There was an ambulance I saw raided, and so forth. You definitely had the Americans supervise. In many cases, but what they really want to do, and this sort of augurs for how it was before the surge and how it will be after the surge, as much as it does during the surge, there was a great emphasis on just not doing too much for the Iraqis. The MP unit I was with doesn't like the term training because it's not accurate. There will be a certain kind of trainer that will be direct, and usually that's from something called the CPAT unit, which is a civilian contracted out program under the State Department. What they would do is mentor, teach, coach, and mentor is the sort of ubiquitous slogan, whereby they would try and get the Iraqis, if they had a problem with, say, their fuel supplies, get the Iraqis to send reports up the chain through the Interior Ministry, as opposed to just asking directly to give them stuff from Camp Liberty's fuel depot. That would be the sort of thing that you would see with Iraqi police, and the dichotomy that I saw was they were getting so much better, according to both the Iraqi police commanders I talked to and the MPs I talked to, at doing those sorts of things, at working their chains, at getting a greater amount of logistic capability.
And some of that,
let me just finish the point.
Yeah.
And just as that's going, the greater problem of sectarianism was going at the same pace, if not outstripping it. And so you sort of ended up wondering to what degree will the ultimate Iraqi police force that we bequeath to the Iraqis be just an agglutination of militias and death squads that really know how to work a logistical chain.
Well, you see, I don't know. What I thought was that the American presence in my Iraqi army battalion was a factor that was definitely strengthening the nationalist, Jundis, the soldiers, and it was a force where, I saw Iraqis and Americans working together to, talked about investigations that they had against officers and individuals who were working with militias.
Yeah.
That, it seemed that, they were getting better on the sectarian, issue. That I thought that there was a sense where the suspicions of a supportive MIT team that I was with, and regular, daily, often many times a day conversations with the commander of the Iraqi battalion it was attached to, cut down on the sectarian corruption. The other interesting thing that I found was that, I thought that the problem was screening, which I think it was in the beginning of the war. But what the real problem, as I saw it, was that, in a weird way, logistics, when you can't get a soldier, unspoiled rations or a paycheck, he is more susceptible to being bribed to look the other way or to cooperate with, sectarian militias and terrorists. And there's also, of course, the ubiquitous problem of kidnapping of family and so forth. But I did see the beginnings of a trust that was... I think that ultimately what the Americans do in the surge, which is why I support it, is they are generally very beneficial influence as they kind of go out and work with the security forces. And they provide, for now, a force that's on the ground that is trusted by the local population, whereas it's not fair to expect the citizens at this point to trust, especially the Iraqi police, and I'd say even in some cases the Iraqi army. Obviously, also in many ways the Iraqi army. So, in that respect, I'd say that those are the two really important things that I think that the surge is accomplishing in Baghdad.
Well, let me ask you a question about that.
Yeah.
Did you get a sense from the Iraqi army units that you were with what they thought of the police? Because I heard...
yes, I did.
Yeah. Tell me about
they
that.
thought that the police were useless terrorist thugs who were likely to kidnap you. Everything you said about the police rang with what I was hearing about the police when I was there in the piece.
Well, what's interesting to me is that, when I would hear the police talk about the army, they would use much the same terms, that either the army was some kind of, other sectarian force, or that they had been infiltrated by the terrorists, which, many Shiites will just use as a generic term for Sunnis. And, sometimes, in this one case, the commander of the Qarq Directorate, which is basically all the police forces west of the Tigris in Baghdad, is this guy named General Salawani, and he's a former Republican Guard officer. And he was saying to me, just when I interviewed him a couple times, he was talking about the Iraqi security forces writ large. And, some of this I think is appropriate to take with the coloration of knowing that the guy was, a Saddam-era Republican Guard officer, which was, a force that existed to secure the regime and not the country. But, he was talking in very vitriolic terms about how he thought this entire generation of Iraqis is doomed, that everyone who grew up under the Iran-Iraq war from 80 to 88
I saw that in the piece,
was basically touched in the head in some way, that as a war generation, they wouldn't be able to just become functional members of society, and what you needed was just this enormous crackdown. An anecdote that I heard from Kurds, interestingly enough, as well as Arabs, was that in 1978 there was a big jaywalking problem in Baghdad. You've heard this one?
It's a great story.
Yeah.
No, tell the viewers, it's a good story.
Well, there's this jaywalking problem supposedly in Baghdad in 1978. And Saddam tries to deal with it, and he figures, as Saddam Hussein, the right thing to do is basically find a jaywalker, throw him in prison for 6 months, probably torture him, levy an enormous fine on his family, and within a couple years, no one jaywalks at all. And eventually, the order is lifted, and until the end of Saddam Hussein, this reign of terror about jaywalking remains so strong, this fear of what will happen to you if you jaywalk, because the punishment was so onerous and so restrictive that just no one jaywalks at all. And so this becomes a symbol to people like General Salawani, the former Republican Guard officer who's now in charge of Qarq Directorate, for viewing the collapse of Iraq as a whole. That he believes, and I heard this from as much as I didn't expect to hear it from Kurdish politicians as well, that Iraqis, they would say, need to be taught the meaning of the rule of law again. And what they really mean by the rule of law isn't what you and I understand by the rule of law, but rather the rule of force. And it was
you hear that.
It was an astonishing thing to hear.
I mean, listen, I'll be honest with you. I always bristled at the idea that when people sort of talked about, but it's true. A lot of Iraqis at this point, and I say this as somebody who supported the war and believes that we have, we can go over my position, but I think it's fairly boring at this point for the viewer. But yeah, you definitely hear a lot of Iraqis say it was better under Saddam, even as though Saddam was absolutely terrible. You also, by the way, will hear a lot of Iraqis who didn't live very well under Saddam. I mean, I think if I didn't go to Sadr City, but if you talk to the people who lived there under the sanction years, I don't think that they would welcome Saddam back. Or you talk to a Kurd who was, living, in political prisoner, jail for 10 years, they probably wouldn't want Saddam either. So in some ways, it's kind of where you go. But for the average Iraqi who lived in Baghdad, at least, it was a place where there wasn't, the only criminals really were the ones running the state. And, you always had to worry about, the sort of capricious violence of, one of the local Ba'athist bosses or, higher up in the system. And they did, and there are true and terrible stories about that. But at the same time, you kind of knew what to do, what would happen to you if you got out of line, if you jaywalked.
Right.
But now you don't know. There's no rhyme or reason as to why you would be targeted by, a truck bomb. There's no rhyme or reason as to why you might be kidnapped on the way to the market that day. There's no rhyme or reason, and that is it's a state of absolute and abject terror. I think that at least in areas of Baghdad that I saw, and I submit that there were other neighboring areas where this was not yet the case, I saw the beginnings of breaking that abject terror. But I wouldn't say that it's like, and therefore we've, I can't say at this point in Iraq, and therefore we've turned the corner, because I can see scenarios both ways where if we prematurely handed these neighborhoods back to the Iraqi security forces, they would probably turn back into sectarian organizations.
Well, I'd like to pivot from there to, you mentioned, and it's an interesting thing about, this reign of terror being broken, or this cycle of terror being broken, to, one of the things that seemed, most auspicious over the last couple months, which is the division of the insurgency and of tribal forces, particularly in Anbar province, to some degree, we're starting to see in Diyala, and to some degree south of Baghdad, against al-Qaeda in Iraq. And I know both of us tried to do this. One of the things I tried to do when I went out to Iraq was get into Ramadi so I could talk to some of the figures behind the so-called Anbar awakening, to find out, to what degree is this a legit thing, to what degree is this going to fizzle away. And what I wanted to ask you about is, my sense of this has been for a while that, the only thing that really stops the tribes or the more Sunni nationalist insurgents to go after al-Qaeda, stops them from doing that, is, our presence in the complicating factors of both, the Shiite scourging of Sunnis and the American presence. And I wanted to ask you, you've talked to a lot of sheikhs around Baghdad who are turning against al-Qaeda. Lay out the rules of the road for what they want from the U.S. Some of them do say, if not indefinitely, we want you to stay for a while. What do they want from us? And what could we give them that perhaps wouldn't require 170,000 American forces in Iraq?
Sure. Well, I think the first thing they want that I got the impression of is better guns and to never run out of bullets, which is it's a double-edged problem, because you know what? Right now, anything to defeat al-Qaeda in Iraq is probably worth it at this point. I think you would agree. I mean, al-Qaeda in Iraq is really just awful.
If we're talking about the broader strategic question of what we leave behind, at year X when we get out.
And I would say
this is the cardinal strategic concern.
There's a humanitarian interest in killing as many al-Qaeda in Iraq leaders as possible.
Inshallah.
Inshallah, exactly. But
Indeed.
here's
So
that's the first thing they want. But the problem is that if you were to create yet another militia, and this is the problem that Lieutenant Colonel Pinkerton talked to me about a lot, then it would actually be there are going to be problems with that in the future as well. So what we're doing right now is at least where I was in Abu Ghraib, they had basically gotten a lot of the tribal sheikhs who were on our side to submit young men to join the Iraqi security forces, which then again creates potentially another problem of sectarianism within the security forces. But that might be a better problem to have than creating another militia that's loyal. You know what I'm saying? I mean, at least they're going to be in a uniform. At least there's a potential that they're going to go police their areas and not this is not going to be a force for an army that they're not going to be able to take the police that is already in Abu Ghraib and then go somewhere else or something like that. So in that respect, I think right now they want that. But the other thing a lot of the tribes want is they don't feel that there's any advocate for them within the Iraqi government, which is to say that the current Sunni bloc that's there, which are kind of comprised of ex-Baathists, some Islamists, and so forth, didn't really take into account the needs or the constituency of a lot of the Sunni sheikhs, and they don't really feel that they're very responsive. They don't trust, of course, the majority Shia government. They don't. They think Maliki, you'll hear, is an Iranian agent, but they don't really like anybody. So the one people that they feel at this point they can trust are really the folks that they started off kind of rebelling against when they teamed up or gave hospitality to Al Qaeda, and that's the Americans. But listen, Kevin Drum, Spencer Ackerman, and Matthew Iglesias are correct when they point out that the rebellion of these tribal sheikhs happened before the surge. And that's true. They happened in September of 2006 when the leader of Al Qaeda in Iraq, a guy by the name of al-Masri, the Egyptian, who's an Iraqi, but it's interesting that we call him the Egyptian, creates the Islamic State in Iraq, which they see as an affront to their kind of tribal authority. And they also, at this point, I think, realize that Al Qaeda's goal is kicking us out of Iraq is going to maybe be fine for people who can get to Syria or Iran. But for them, even though it's true, a lot of Sunnis who think they're still the majority, they think that they could actually maybe lose. They would have the Americans and the Shia fighting against them, and that would be a potential catastrophe for them. So those two sort of things that, Al-Qaeda's inviting nothing but trouble for us right now, and they kind of, were awful guests, I think created a dynamic where they're kind of going to work with the Americans right now because it's the least bad option for them. And, at the same time, they will also say, you can't stay here indefinitely. So I think that the tribal sheikhs, on the one hand, would be big, at least the ones I talked to, would be very much supportive of keeping troops in the area for the short term, but then having some sort of status of forces agreement or something that would sort of say these are the terms in which some Americans would stay, or these are the terms in when this is the timeline, this is the terms in when you leave.
Well, so here's the question.
Yeah.
The country basically wants, if not, full withdrawal. I think the latest poll is something like 63% of the country wants.
Those polls I'm very wary of.
Sure.
I'm super wary of those.
Okay, well then we'll take out polls. I think you would agree that there's a general sense around the country that the war needs to be wound down. As much as from your perspective you find that wrong.
There's a general sense also that, for the most part, where there are American troops, now that they're out there, it is a better option than being left to either any of the kind of, confessional terror groups that would fill in that power void.
Well, I'm not sure the country would. I'm not sure. I'm talking about the United States, not Iraq. In terms.
You're talking about the U.S.
Yeah, I'm talking about the U.S. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
I wasn't talking about polls of Iraqis. I just mean the United States.
Okay.
So
63. Okay.
Yeah. So the U.S. is basically tired of the war. It's certainly fair to say that the Iraqis don't want us there, but they may acquiesce to us there under a variety of conditions. The issue is we want to get out of there, and we also don't want Al Qaeda to take over a significant portion of the country, really any portion of the country, where they can ultimately export their nefarious intentions and increase capability. Yeah. The thing that I'm trying to get at is because I've been writing about this for a while and finding what we've been seeing manifested, which is the longer al-Qaeda stays in the Sunni areas, the more the Sunni Iraqis end up hating them for precisely the same nationalistic reasons that many of them hate us, if perhaps even more intensely than they hate us.
By the way, this is a point of concurrence where I just want to point out that you and I agree, Spencer, but we are kind of, that sort of casts us in opposition to what is a pretty widespread view among counterterrorism experts like Peter Bergen, who would say that the longer we stay, the more likely you're going to have sort of Al-Qaeda is going to gain more support in places like Iraq. And I think in the periphery where you don't face the violence, it's true that like in probably the Gulf states, you probably, they probably are going to get more Al-Qaeda folks. But in Iraq itself, the good news is that I think you have a lot of battle-hardened Iraqis who are going to be just, more enthusiastic and more kind of totally morally clear about their desire to destroy Al-Qaeda, which is a good thing.
It's a very good thing. And so what I'm trying to get at is if we could, take, year X, whatever we're at right now, say a year or so out, and draw down to some degree. To what degree would, the Anbar Salvation Front and some of the other, even anti-American insurgent operations like the Islamic Army in Iraq or the 1920 Revolution Brigade or Hamas Iraq and, the
1920 Revolution Brigade, as far as I've heard, is now basically working I don't want to say for us, but for the Anbar Salvation Front. They've fully turned on Al-Qaeda.
Right. So what I want to know is, if we could, come up with some kind of practical suggestion, is it your sense that if we could, give some kind of, logistical capability or weapons or what have you, or, encourage more of them to, join the army, say, in Anbar province, would we be able to more or less safely, draw down, if not withdraw, over the next couple of years? Let's leave aside the sectarian question for a moment. I'm interested in the fighting Al-Qaeda question. What's your sense of that from your reporting?
I think that it's quite possible. In fact, it was interesting because, a commander that was working on the Abu Ghraib thing, I don't think I can say this on the record yet, so I just have to say a commander. An American commander said, listen, if I'm successful doing this stuff right now, then the Democrats will get what they want, and I'll get what I want, which is, stability in Abu Ghraib, and, that. So there is definitely, I think that there is something to that, though I would caution that at this point, I don't think anybody involved in the Tribal Alliance wants to hear any timeline or anything because it's such a precarious situation for them. Which is to say, at this point, they really do need the Americans there as, in some ways, sort of as their advocates and to protect these populations. And they're advocates so they can join the national institutions, which they're agreeing to join. They're not as anti-government, I think, as, Harith al-Dari would suggest or, other figures even some figures who are in the parliament who claim to sort of represent some of these Sunni areas.
So we are really talking about a situation. Sorry to interrupt you. Where
2009 is when the next elections are, and I think that is a good way to think about. At that point we'll have more time to train up and to work with and build more trust, and also at that point there will be an election, which I think is the best lever of them all, really. The elections in Iraq is the best way, local elections, provincial elections, hopefully will be a better way, and I think will be a more effective way than threatening to leave to get the national government, which I am still pessimistic about, to do the sorts of things it needs to do to get on with reconciliation.
Well, we should talk about that now because over the last couple months, and in particular the last couple weeks, there's been a tremendous amount of effort on the part of the American Embassy and the American Military Command to test the government of Nouri al-Maliki and see what kind of political unity it can possibly build up. And the sense that I've certainly gotten, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this, is that Maliki is basically a lost cause in terms of sectarianism. That he's had opportunities to expand his power base that haven't gone well. Sorry?
Yeah, he's like Mr. Half Measure.
Right, and you've got all these reconciliation efforts that the U.S. pushed, and particularly the former ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad pushed very hard, in particular the oil law, which has turned out to still, in fact, move forward. It's just created more acrimony where it was supposed to diminish precisely that kind of
Aren't you
sectarian.
surprised, Spencer, that a guy who used to be one of the leaders of a party called the Islamic Call, based in Tehran, would be sectarian?
I know.
Who
can
it a
believe
shock?
this?
I can't imagine. How could we have figured that out? Anyway,
Right. But the point is,
I'm not a particular fan right now of Maliki because I have, one of the stories that I covered when I was in Iraq was how the target list for the Iraqi army from General Aboud Khanbar all end up being Sunnis.
He's the general in charge of the Baghdad security plan.
Yeah, he's the general in charge of the Baghdad, and I just wrote a story that came out on Friday, today, as we're doing this, about how he's put on Prime Minister Maliki's desk 15 Sunni politicians that should have their immunity lifted for prosecution. And there are, in fact, as I get into in this story, there are Sunni politicians in the parliament who are terrorists, it seems, based on the evidence that was shared with me by sources. There are also Shia politicians in the parliament who served in high positions, as you know, who are also terrorists and ethnic cleansers, who probably should also be purged and have their immunity lifted. And the problem is that it just seems to me that they can't go full out, and this screws everything up, because if Maliki goes forward with the prosecution recommendations on his desk, that's basically like prosecuting almost everyone in the Tawafuk or the National Dialogue Front, which is this sort of cross-Sunni organization which has good people and bad people in it. And it's not going to get anything accomplished, and it's going to end up letting this guy Khalaf al-Ayan, who probably is really bad, who may be implicated in the May 17 attacks in Mosul, not to mention have some role, at least, I found that the TNT that was found in his house in Yarmouk matched the TNT that was in the suicide belt in the parliament bombing. So this guy probably should be prosecuted, it would appear, or at least there should be, some court of trial to look at this evidence in the open. And if he's lumped in with guys like Adnan al-Dulaimi and other Sunni politicians, who just are critics of Maliki, it's a disaster in my. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, and here's where the rubber hits.
It doesn't get anything done. Yeah.
Where the rubber hits the road is what the alternative to Maliki might be. And over the last couple weeks, we've started to see it take shape, and it's coming from, in probably a very surprising and dramatic way today, the reemergence of Muqtada Sadr from wherever it is he's been hiding.
I guess it's a bit of bad news, because I was always saying a bit of the good news was that he hadn't shown his face yet, but he just reappeared and now looks in Najaf.
But look what I think it was Kufa actually where he gave his sermon.
Was it Kufa or Najaf?
I'm pretty sure it was Kufa.
All right.
But where I found the most interesting fault line to run with Sadr is over the past couple weeks what he's appeared to be doing is really go to precisely the people we've been relying on in Anbar province to fight al-Qaeda, the Anbar Salvation Front of a guy you profiled very well, Sheikh Abdul Sattar al-Rishawi. And they seem to be rather receptive to a kind of nationalistic, anti-Takfiri, to some degree, tolerant but still rhetorically anti-American front that can, give some kind of centripetal force outside of the sectarian context that you just see with Maliki, and you see
You've
with...
been really good, by the way, on your blog. Too hot for the TNR.
Too hot for TNR.
I'm just saying that your coverage of this stuff and sort of it's been interesting, and I think you pointed out there that I don't know what this means. You've noted that there's a split among the Sadrites, maybe. Yeah, it's a really important time, because we don't know what Sadr's juice is. And if I may, I will say this for a fact. And I'm probably going to end up regretting this. I think Sadr maybe is a little bit of a punk. There you go, and I'll tell you why. Let me tell you why I think Sadr maybe is a little bit of a punk.
Okay, let's talk about punk rock Muqtada Sadr.
All right, okay. Here's why he might be a little bit of a punk. Because first of all, if you notice, when he left, there's an article in the Guardian claiming to have had the last interview with him in Iraq before he fled, saying he fears for his family and he fears for his life, and it sort of coincides with General David Petraeus' arrival in Baghdad. And he was calling a lot of these sorts of demonstrations and sort of issuing edicts, but for a long time did not show his face. Now he's sort of reemerged, but we'll see what happens. But only after it appears that maybe he was considerably weakened, maybe there was a split, and there seemed to be in this period. At least the rumor mill was that he was in Iran for a long period of time, which I think degrades his national credentials. But finally, and I found this out actually through Richard Miniter, I think a guy we mutually know, a good friend of mine, who points out that I think it's the autobiography or something that Sheikh Nasrallah of Lebanon visited Sadr's father and talked about how this guy, when he was a teenager in Iraq, was like obsessed with video games and American war movies, and was like a very unserious kind of person. And maybe, just maybe, and I know that Anthony Shadid and wonderful reporters have said otherwise, maybe he is not now today the same sort of nationalist figure he was 2 years ago.
I see your point.
Because also his guys leave the government, but yet the Sadrites sort of stay in the parliament. Yet the ministers leave, and the ostensible reason they gave, if you remember, was because we're not good at managing ministries. I mean, there is a kind of it's not been a good 4 months for Muqtada Sadr.
Well, I don't know about that. For one thing, we should probably interpret his movement, in and out of politics and out of the national government, out of the Maliki cabinet, as being an issue not so much, between us and Sadr, but Sadr's jockeying inside Shiite politics. And secondly, he comes back. Was he in Iran? I don't know. That's certainly been the contention of the U.S. military.
Right. I don't know either.
I'll just take it for what it is at that point. But one thing that is significant is the day that he comes back, or that he shows himself in his sermon today, is the same day that his principal rival, the head of the now redubbed Supreme Iraqi Islamic Council, Abdulaziz al-Hakim, does go to Iran.
Psych.
As he seeks treatment for his lung cancer. So
right, but keep in mind that it was right after they sort of did that whole thing where they said no more Velayat al-Faqih. We don't believe in the Khameneist vision. We are taking orders from Sistani.
Right.
And
so
But you're right. That's a good point.
Yeah, I mean what I've heard is that basically what should we call them? Psych now instead of scary? Can we say psych?
You recommended calling them psych because you do not believe that they're really distancing themselves from Iran. You think it's all like street theater, which I think you might be right on, because why would he go to Iran for the operation and not, say, Jordan or the U.S.?
I mean, are there better oncologists in Iran? I have no idea. Probably not.
I'm sure there are better oncologists in Iran. Sure. Okay.
So the point being is that what Sadr now has a chance of doing is both, showing that he really has not just this kind of internal Shiite vector behind him, but if he can, say to the broader Shiite constituency that he brings together Sunnis who are willing to kill the people who kill Shiites, then there's no more argument for the Maliki government remaining in power, really, except their own desire to remain in power. And
careful, because he might be willing to sort of say that, right? But can he deliver? I mean, which is to say,
sure.
The word that I heard was that Sadr's commanders were bought off or sort of influenced or now more loyal to the Quds force, which is to say that at the lower sort of street level on the militia side, that Iran was sort of trying to muscle him out a little bit. That's what I'd heard. He's back,
and I buy that.
Yeah.
I just need to say that this is at least the pitch that Sadr is making, regardless of its credibility.
And also, he's an idiot. I mean, he's not an idiot. He's obviously a very clever person, but I'm just saying that he's not somebody who can run a government in any way. And even though there isn't much of a stretch of the central government, there's still a lot of people who do collect paychecks, and he doesn't bring anything like an Abdul Mahdi or a lot of the people who are now, you know what I'm saying? There's no skill in running, you know what I'm saying? What is this guy? He's not even, he doesn't even know good doctrine. He's not even a good Shia cleric.
Well, the Mahdi army, you have to at least concede that the Mahdi army has done probably a better job of policing Sadr City and in terms of getting like sanitation collected in Sadr City and getting like basic supplies to people in Sadr City than probably any other neighborhood of Baghdad. Do I believe Sadr could actually run a government? No, that makes very little sense. But
right.
we're not talking about them just really having nothing. There are reasons apart. There are political reasons as opposed to just sheer theological reasons why people in Sadr City are so loyal to Sadr, or so loyal to the Sadrist movement, if not necessarily the personage of Muqtada Sadr. And we are running out of time, so I want to get from you, what you thought, in kind of a broader sense, you were most surprised about when you went to Iraq, and then I'll give my own.
Wow, the most surprising thing that I came away with in Iraq. I guess I was, how do I say this? I was surprised by the fact that I found that there really was I'm not giving you a good answer right now. I guess what I'm saying, I was surprised by how many people in the military and in the Iraqi government, with the exception of Shalabi, were pointing the dirty finger at Iran. And this was a pleasant surprise for me because I had done a lot of reporting in January, as you know, sort of talking about Iran playing both sides, working with Sunni and Shia. It was sort of dismissed by a certain, segment on the, of analysts saying it's impossible. But I think we're now really seeing it. In fact, today, David Kilcullen, I think, said in one of these teleconferences that it's important to think of Iran as pressing its Persian interests, which are just sort of geostrategic. And I did see and hear a lot about that. So it was surprising to sort of see how much of that. And also what was surprising to see was how there was this resentment of a lot of Iraq's neighbors among a lot of the tribal sheikhs that I talked to. And because I had assumed that they would sort of seek, like anyone would, whatever outside influence would sort of fill the void when the Americans left. And they really sort of just resented the idea, and actually some of them were calling Al-Qaeda like an invader. So that was those were hopeful surprises, in that respect. I mean, I'm trying to think if I could give you like a negative surprise. I don't know. It's incredibly hot in Iraq. And
surprise!
Anyone could possibly imagine. I knew it was going to be hot, but I didn't know it was going to be so hot that I would actually come to appreciate that I have sweat glands, because if I didn't have them, my skin would crackle off.
Cold in Mosul at night in February.
Okay.
Up in the mountains, very, very cold.
What was your surprise?
That surprised me a great deal. It's cold in Mosul at night.
There you go.
It turns out to be, I'll get in trouble for saying this, but, the terrain is much like Iraqi Kurdistan.
I love this.
We love the Kurds here at Blogging Heads TV.
We do.
All right, thanks a lot, Eli. I really appreciate it, and I'm going to...
And I want to just commend again to the viewers. Please, the Spencer's articles in The Nation and The Washington Monthly, even if you were a conservative viewer, you should check them out online, or even, I don't know if I would recommend buying The Nation magazine. I don't think you should support the institution, but Spencer's article is very good, and I would just say it is a textbook example of how to bring the reader in with a feature with fine detail of the scene.
Well, my friend
is very worth it. There's a scene where you sort of talk about it's the first sentence, the little picture of Imam Hussein, it's very good.
Well, thank you. And my friend is way too kind, and as some of the readers of my blog know, and many of them who've taken me to task for this, regardless of where you stand on the Iraq question, you really ought to read Eli's stuff in The Sun, particularly everything he did from Baghdad, which is truly amazing. It's stuff that, and I hope you take this in the spirit that it's intended, which is a very high compliment that one reporter could extend to another. Stuff that I read and just wish I had gotten. And when I saw a lot of the stuff that you've done, particularly that fantastic story you did about the interrogation you witnessed, I wish that that could have run under my byline.
I was lucky.
You did some amazing stuff over there, and you'll continue.
Thank you. And all right, so we're big fans, and we're
fans of one another.
And I think it shows that it's possible to squash the rhetorical violence between the two sides, East Coast, West Coast, coming together.
We're gonna squash this beef, Eli.
We're gonna squash the peace.
All right, beef squash. Hey. All right, see you later.
Good. See you.